Hi, welcome back to Space Thoughts. Today I'm going to talk about an issue that has really been kind of gaining a lot of steam ever since the Russians did their ASAT demonstration back in November, and that's this idea of a destructive ASAT test ban. Now, immediately after this happened, NGOs came out and said, "Oh, we need, this is why we need a destructive ASAT test ban to discourage this type of behavior or prevent this type of behavior." And my cue has always been, well, that's a nice idea, but in reality, does it really work? Now, this is starting to gain a little bit of momentum in academia and in NGOs in particular. They're starting to push this idea. And there was a paper that came out at the beginning of the week that actually addressed this issue. And I'll bring it up real here for you to look at. And it's basically called the ASAT Prisoner's Dilemma, making the case for U.S. leadership and a unilateral moratorium on kinetic energy anti-satellite testing. Now, I don't get personal about authors and stuff like that. And I think that's unprofessional. I criticize and comment on the ideas, not the people who write them. I had a lot of issues with this paper, and I think and again, if you've watched my videos, if you read my work, you understand that I'm really big on this idea of lawfare, the whole idea of using law and legal maneuvering to actually supplant or supplement kinetic activities in war. And I think that's something that's growing, especially in outer space. Well, this whole idea of, unilateral test ban really gives me the shivers for a couple of reasons. And I'm going to look at the paper, and really, I think this paper really starts off bad to begin with. Over 70 years ago, two RAND researchers structured the fundamental tenets in the game theory of what later became known as the prisoner's dilemma, a description of a situation in which two perfectly rational actors, ignorant of the decision of the other, will wisely pursue their own self-interest, but ultimately suffer a worse fate than if they had cooperated. For one thing, this is a game. And it's a theoretical game, and sometimes that works in geopolitics, and sometimes it doesn't. Geopolitics is so fluid. It isn't fluid; it's chaotic. I mean, at one moment, you could have a set of circumstances that is shifting geopolitics in one direction, but instantly, a variable could change, or a new variable could just pop into existence that totally destroys the equation. So it's hard to game geopolitics, and that's one of my criticisms of what's called comparative geopolitics. In other words, ideally, this is what we think based on our ideals. This is what we think, a geopolitical actor, how they should act, and instead of using classical geopolitics, see what they're doing and why and then extrapolating from that or why they're doing. So again, I'm not a big fan of game theory in terms of this, just because I think reality, the labs are good, computer models are great, but no, all the times you control the variables, and you can, depending on whether or not you have an intended political outcome, you can always change the variables to meet your political outcome. It's not that way in real world. And, being a lawyer, having done litigation, I can tell you, there are surprises, and surprises will always throw off your plans and destroy your theory and just make a mess of your game plan. So, I mean, geopolitics is a lot about improvisation. So the whole rationale of this is basically that it makes an assumption that geopolitical actors, states, entities, what have you, are rational players. So what's rational? This gets into the idea of globalism. In other words, we're all one big world. We are all in it together. We're one happy. We can all get along together. We should be able to get along together. That doesn't work in reality. The world is geopolitical. In other words, states have interests, and states pursue those interests, and actions they take are in the furtherance of their interest and not the interest of others. So the idea that from what is being extrapolated here is rational. Rational, in my opinion, means pursuing your own state interests. What are your state interests? So applying this to ASAT testing, and basically here's another quibble I have with it. Over the past 15 years, 4 countries, China in 2007, the United States in 2008, India in 2019, and now Russia this past year, have conducted such tests. using ground-based kinetic energy missiles to deliberately destroy their own satellites. Okay, big quibble. One, the Operation Burnt Frost, where the U.S. intercepted USA 193, which was a disabled satellite, wasn't an ASAT test. It was basically designed to intercept using a capability ancillary to missile defense. It had the effect of saying, oh, the U.S. did an ASAT test or capability, and that was basically being promoted by NGOs like this, like this paper is promoting. But it wasn't a test. It was a legitimate reason. It had the after effect of showing an ASAT capability, but that wasn't the intent of the launch. And that's everything. And trust. And I've done a lot of research on this, and everything I've seen that's declassified basically points in that direction. So the whole idea that the U.S. did one in 2008 is, in 2008 is not, that just basically falsifies this. Now, the U.S., the last real ASAT test the U.S. did, destructive ASAT test, was back in the 80s during the Reagan administration with the air launch ASAT that basically destroyed the Sol-1 satellite. And again, that's something that, that happened back in the 80s. If this paper had really promoted that, I probably would have been a little better with it, but it didn't. These tests have created many thousands of pieces of debris in low Earth orbit in the process. Okay, basically the Sol-1 test that I just talked about, all that the satellite was at a very low orbit anyways, and most of that debris came down within a relatively short time. Even the intercept of USA 193, and I'm not saying it was an ASAT test by mentioning this, but even the debris from that was short-lived and fell to the Earth. And India's test as well, most of that debris was in a very low orbit and it deorbited. So you can't compare what China did in 2007, which was in a very high orbit, and the demonstration the Russians did in November in 2021 to the same thing, because those were in very high orbits. And I think those are more deliberate. I mean, like I said, in case of the Russian incident, it was more of a demonstration than a test. And I did a video on the Russian ASAT demonstration back in November, I believe, and you can go back and look at that if you want, and I discuss all of that. So I think those, between this idea of, rational actors and the way that they illuminate some of the things that have happened with these incidents here, it really doesn't give the paper a lot of credence in my opinion. Now, I'm going to build on that a little bit more, is this whole idea of basically the idea of U.S. leadership in this area. So the whole idea that's being promoted is the U.S. should unilaterally ban all non-destructive ASAT tests. In other words, we're the United States. We don't have an active ACE. We don't have a fielded ASAT capability, but we're going to ban ourselves from performing any future ASAT test. Well, that's fun, but the idea is to, actually, if you're going to do something like this, to sit down and talk with people before you impose it on yourself. This whole idea is the rationale is that if we do it, if we set the example by banning ourselves, in other words, tying our own hands, everybody else will agree and tie their own hands. And that's not the way it works. I mean, let's be blunt, we live in a very dangerous world right now. I mean, and the world, just because of geopolitics and state interests, what have you, it's a dangerous place, and outer space is becoming dangerous, very dangerous as well. For an actor like the Russian Federation or the People's Republic of China to say, okay, we're going to stop all ASAT testing because the U.S. made this grandiose gesture, it's not going to happen. They're going to give lip service to it. They're and such, but they're not going to stand away from it. So, and bottom line is that the whole, this whole idea is why the PRC and the Russian Federation don't need to do any testing anymore. They, in my opinion, even though I don't have access to raw intelligence, and if I did, I wouldn't be talking about it anyways. But the idea is they probably have field. I know that I can probably say very accurately that the Russians have a fielded capability with their Noodle system, and the PRC probably likely has a fielded hard kill ASAT system as well. So they really don't need to do any destructive testing. They've already got the capability, and in my opinion, the capacity to do it. So where does that leave the United States? Well, we've tied our hands. If we basically go out there and say we're going to impose this unilateral ASAT test, destructive ASAT testing ban on ourselves. So this gets back to other things like the hypersonic FOBS test that the PRC performed. back during the summer, and other things. And the whole idea is we may need to develop a capability to counter something like that if a FOB system is actually deployed. And the best way to actually defeat a FOB, in my opinion, and again, this isn't just not just pulling it off the top of my head, but I know actually doing the research, is to deploy an ASAT. And it's not popular. It's not touchy feely, and it's definitely it would raise a lot of ire among certain groups. The idea of sustainability and such. But it really is the best way to defend against that. But if you can't test it, how are you going to know it's going to work? So I think in this case, we're really tying our own hands for no reason at all, because basically our adversaries, the Russians, the PRC, they're going to laugh at us. And it's not going to come out as, instead of coming out as a position of strength, it's going to come out as weak. In other words, okay, the U.S. is actually, they're handicapping themselves, and guess what? We still have this capability. So what's the rationale for this? NGOs do what NGOs do. I mean, and granted, they get paid for this, and I understand that, and they have to do work like this. And this is basically, it's basically the same tune with a different instrument. In other words, if we sign an agreement, everybody will get along, and it doesn't work that way. And again, this whole idea of lawfare is that, just because you sign a contract doesn't mean somebody is going to actually abide by the terms of it. So I think that's a lot what's going on here. One thing that really caught on to me back in 2019, after India performed its ASAT test demonstration, I don't know how you're going to, you could call it either. An NGO came out, a couple NGOs came out and said they violated the quote norm of non-destructive ASAT testing. And that kind of caught me by surprise, and saying, well, where did this norm come from? In my opinion, it was basically something that the NGOs just threw out there, trying to create a narrative, try and actually create international law. In other words, they were engaging in lawfare. Now, my challenge has been ever since the Russian ASAT demonstration is that, well, if this norm existed, didn't they actually break that norm? But I haven't really seen any NGOs coming out, that the ones who actually proposed this idea of a norm of non-destructive ASAT testing, come out and say that. So in my opinion, the norm doesn't exist. However, even if the norm did exist, the Russians broke it. So does that mean if the Russians decide to play games and say, okay, yeah, this is a good idea, we'll sign on to it, does that mean they're going to stop? No. Does it mean they're not going to use ASATs in the future? No. It's basically, this is lawfare in action. And I talked about lawfare a lot last year in a couple of videos. You can go back to those and actually look at those, go through those again. And I've written extensively about lawfare. But that's basically what's happening here. Is this is NGOs again playing the lawfare game, and they're trying to create a narrative. And this time they're trying to get the U.S. to create a narrative and put itself in, I think, a very weak position. I mean, really, the whole idea, given that the Russians have a proven system and the PRC that likely has a proven system, the whole idea of ASAT testing is moot. Who else is going to test them? Well, maybe India. India has their own geopolitical agenda, their own national interest, and they're doing some maneuvering to further those interests as well. So chances are they're going to look at this and say, no, we're not interested in it. But if you want to make yourself weaker or make yourself look less, or diminish your capability, that's fine. What I think this is ultimately going to lead to is basically NGOs promoting, oh, now that we got this idea of non-destructive testing, we need to ban ASATs outright, the use of ASATs outright, or these kinetic destructive ASATs outright. And again, this gets back to the idea that if you do this whole idea of, well, I can sign an ASAT ban, but that doesn't mean that once a war breaks out, once conflict breaks out, they're not going to be used. And believe me, it's very, very, it would be strategically unwise not to use them, because in the case of the US, our systems are very vulnerable to these types of weapons. And not to mention the psychological impact. Even if you destroy a few satellites with kinetic weapons, the psychological impact would be amazing. On top of that, the whole idea is that if an adversary destroys 1 or 2 satellites, the U.S. might be less willing to actually put some of its more expensive assets in harm's way, lest they be targeted and destroyed. So the whole idea of an ASAT ban, which I think this idea is basically a precursor to a proposal for an ASAT ban, is really lawfare in action. Now, this was tried once before during the Obama administration, and it went nowhere. The question is, what will happen with this administration? Will they sign on to it? I don't know. I don't have inside information on that. My advice would be, no, this is a bad idea, all in all, because it's actually leading to other things. But understand, in my opinion, this is lawfare. This is NGOs promoting lawfare, and in my opinion, NGOs are really lawfare foot soldiers. They put out narratives, and they try to get them to gain traction and create and by asserting there are these norms, and by saying, and by extension, getting other states to legally bind themselves to them. So again, it's not. This whole thing right now isn't about keeping the peace. It's preventing war, and there are two differences, because if you're constantly looking for peace, you're going to be less inclined to actually take actions that would prevent a war. And there are several distinctions in that, but that, as a lawyer, as somebody who looks at the legal system and geopolitics and the world as an adversarial system, which it is, basically that is a distinction. You can't be looking for peace. You need to be looking to prevent war. Agreements like this aren't going to prevent war, and by extension, you're not going to have peace. And that's just the way things work, in my opinion. So fundamentally, that's what I have for this. Again, I'm not a big fan of this. I just don't think it's a good idea. But this, right now, in the U.S., the political environment is probably fertile for this type of thing. Whether it happens or not, we'll see. Whether the policymakers decide it's a good idea and do something about it. We're coming up on midterms. Well, in a few months now, we'll be having the midterms. There may be if there's a shift in power in Congress, something like this could actually be pushed back on a little bit, but we'll see what happens. But again, I'm not a fan of this. I think it's a bad idea. And I think again, this is lawfare. This is lawfare in action. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this in outer space and in geopolitics in general. So until next time, we'll talk to you then.